If our purpose is to bring donors into our tribe, we have to have a story that gives them space to actually be an active participant. We have to give them agency within that story and allow room for them to become a character.
I'm Rich Frazier.
And I'm Russ Phaneuf.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement.
We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector.
Let's dive in.
Hi, I'm Russ Phaneuf, your host for this episode of NPFX, the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. I'm flying solo today. My compatriot, Rich Frazier, is out with clients and doing incredible capital campaign consulting. We like to say he's on vacation, but he's actually working. So I'll give Rich a shout out. And today we're talking about storytelling. And, you know, one of IPM's chief strategies when working with nonprofits is to employ storytelling techniques to engage audiences. And we're always looking for new ways and kind of trying to stay on the cutting edge of storytelling. And one of the ways we do that is we have the IPM Consulting Network, and part of our consulting team is Josh Grinowitz. And he's been studying how storytelling is evolving, how audiences are getting savvier, and this is true with especially with younger donors and younger generations of audiences, and what these folks require in order to be engaged. So we were having some internal conversations about this, and we thought, you know, this would be a good topic for a podcast. And so today I've got Josh Grinowitz with me, and we're going to hear from him. And first, Josh, if you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Thanks, Russ. I usually refer to myself as being a chief narrative strategist. That's a lot of what I do consulting work on, and it's focused around strategic storytelling. About 10 years ago, I was working on a public health, somewhat controversial public health program campaign. Mm-hmm. I was director of communications. We had an evaluation that was coming out, and part of my charge was to help push out the program nationwide. Okay. So we had about 24 sites in Chicagoland. We had a couple sites on the East Coast, and we were really trying to push this out. And so we had an evaluation that was in the pipeline, 4 universities, 3 years, and some of the preliminary results looking at like 41 to 73% effectiveness in these communities, right? So I thought, Russ, my job was done for me. I thought like, okay, these cities are going to come pounding at the door. They're going to roll out the red carpets. They're going to send Lincoln Town cars to the airport to pick us up. And who isn't going to want 73% effectiveness in community health initiatives in their community? Yeah. So I figured it was a done deal. I'm like, I don't even know. Yeah, exactly. So I'm like, okay, my job is done for me. This is awesome. So the evaluation comes out when all of this information comes public. I'm bracing myself for the phone to blow up, for everything to happen. Crickets, nothing. Okay. Concurrent with that, around the same time, we had a documentary film that was coming out. Now, this focused more on the street level workers who were actually in the community doing the work. It focused in really on 3 of them, their lives, their home lives, their families, and so on, and the work that they were doing on the ground. Didn't really get into the science of things, maybe touched on it a little bit, but it was really more a feature-length documentary film. And so that film, it premiered at Sundance. It had an art house release across the country, ended up playing on PBS, and everything that we thought was going to happen with the evaluation ended up happening with the film. Wow. You know, the everything. It's a checklist. Roll out the red carpet, sent the Lincoln Town cars. Everybody wanted to talk to us. It was amazing. And so we went from having, you know, a couple dozen sites in 2 cities in 2 years to having a couple dozen cities with over 100 sites. And then today it's an international program. It's completely renowned. It's sought after. There's a couple hundred cities this is being implemented in. But so it was a change maker for the organization, but it was also personally a change maker for me. Like, it was just like everything that I thought I knew from health communications, from public interest communications, was sort of flipped on its head. And I was like, oh, okay, there is something to this story thing. So I went to grad school, I focused on creative writing, and I said, okay, I'm going to figure out how to marry, the social change piece with the storytelling piece. And so
Nice.
that's how I sort of got into the space, and that's my comic book style origin story.
I like it. That's fantastic. Well, sounds like quite a success story that actually applies to other nonprofits and other causes.
And that's what we've seen. 2018, I kind of put out my own shingle and started focusing just on storytelling, primarily with population health and mental wellness programs.
Yeah.
And I've seen the impact of story firsthand in a number of contexts, including how we've been able to manage COVID, really.
Awesome. Well, yeah, and we see the impact of that every day, right? We're in information overload. It's 24/7.
Yes.
You're being bombarded with information and stats and facts and figures. And, that pull of a personal story of the human element is still so biologically very strong with people that I imagine that has a little bit to do with it.
100%. I feel like we are completely wired for story. That's just, from an evolutionary perspective, from a human perspective, we are neurobiologically programmed to lean into stories. They've actually done research where when somebody says, even Russ, when somebody says, I'm going to tell you a story to an audience, they've shown that the audience, the brains activate in the audience. Everybody's like, whoa,
nice
story. I'm programmed to receive.
Yeah. Well, that's Josh. That's why I start every fundraising appeal with once upon a time.
Right.
No, I'm kidding. But the storytelling element is very important to fundraising. 100%. And we're talking about audience engagement, and we're talking about ways to get people involved right from the get-go. So let's talk a little bit about audiences and how are audiences changing, and how do you need to engage them in different ways with storytelling?
Yes. So the first thing I'll say is I don't think it's an attention span thing or a disconnect on that. I feel like it's literally we're just not doing our part to bring them into the story. And so the difference is when you look at the cultural effect of social media, of digital media, we all scroll through our Twitter feeds, our TikTok, our Facebook, and we're absorbing little story units or narrative pieces throughout that entire scroll, right? So that's the way an audience that was born into this and raised up, right? That's the way that they've been conditioned to tell stories. And so the typical approach, what we often do is just to present sort of, here's the story, and we would like you to donate or help, But what we're finding more and more, and I don't think this is just true as a generational thing. I think we're all being conditioned to this way. It's just the early adopters are the younger generation who's grown up into this. And that is that we want to be in the story. We're no longer passive consumers of stories. So it's no longer about, how are you going to help influence this outcome? It's how are you actually helping the vision, right? So it's no longer about the donation being the end, which it often is for us, right? But it's about the change that we're actually making in the world and the donor coming along with that journey and helping make that change. We need to connect those dots a lot more explicitly.
So let's just walk it back a little bit before we lose some of our folks who haven't done a lot of storytelling. Let's walk it back to the beginning. What is storytelling as it relates to audience engagement?
To me, the number one criteria for a story and for storytelling is establishing a sense of movement, having a character at the center of it, and really kind of drive it. It doesn't have to have a beginning, middle, and end, or it can have a beginning, middle, and end, and they could be out of order. All of those things are fine. We can be experimental with it, but we really just need that sense of movement, of bringing us through time and space in some form or fashion to be transformed on the other end. So that at a basic, Russ, that's in a nutshell, sort of the working, our operational definition of story here.
Okay.
Right?
Well, so my next question is how much room do you need to do that? Because I know a lot of nonprofits face budget constraints.
Sure.
They face spec constraints where they can't put together a package that maybe could have a whole story arc to it. Maybe some content needs to be on the web, some could be in direct mail. Maybe they tease some things on social media. How do you look at that kind of real estate, that limited real estate, and still make a story worthwhile and engaging?
Can I geek out for a moment?
Yeah, do it. I love geeking out. Let's geek out.
Okay, let's geek out. So
okay.
I think that campaigns, including capital campaigns, can learn a lot from the MCU.
Oh, really?
So yes, because think of how all of the MCU is interconnected. There's a concept called like transmedia, which is,
and just for a second, the MCU is the Marvel character universe?
Cinematic universe. Yeah, that's why we're getting geeky. Yeah, yes. It's the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So I'm letting my geek flag fly.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
But there's a whole movement in pop culture overall. Jeff Gomez is a big figure in this. He wrote like the kind of interpretive Bible of transmedia in Pirates of the Caribbean, Avatar, some of the big name brands that you could think of. And one of the things that transmedia does is it says, okay, how do we tie all of these products together? How do we tie the story on the back of a cereal box to a comic book that you're reading, to a television show, to film? So I use MCU as an example because a lot of people are familiar, even if they're not familiar, right? So you got Captain America, you got the comic books, but you also have what's happening in the movie, and then you have the Avengers, where Captain America is a character in that, and so on. And so they're all interconnected. And now they're interconnected to Disney's TV shows, and so they're building this very elaborate world. So the analogy here is that we can do the same things with campaigns. Which is exactly, so the appeal letter is one touch point, but we should be able to map out all of these other touch points and say, okay, let's use the appeal letter just to engage and bring people to a landing page. And then where are we going to send them with that landing page? Can we orchestrate sort of an overall vision?
Well, Josh, what it sounds like is you need one key thing for all of this, and that is forethought. You really need to sit down and outline and plan ahead, which, sometimes we don't always have the bandwidth to do that. So how would you suggest, an approach for this?
I would say when you are planning your campaign, a lot of times those campaigns have a lot of urgency to them, and you're just trying to get through them and meet your goals or whatever. But in the planning, you can be planning for the immediate campaign that you are in presently and trying to draw lessons of what do I need to do next year at the same time. Right? So what are the things that I'm doing now, and are there ways that I can test the waters and experiment now that are informing what I'm going to do next year or the year after that. So that's one concrete lesson that we can learn. Ideally, Russ, we would zoom all the way out, and we would say, okay, we need time and breathing room to really map this out. But if we're dealing in reality with the kind of constrictions that a lot of your listeners probably have, then the best approach is to kind of do things concurrently. What am I doing now, in this campaign? And then what are takeaways that I can have in real time that are informing what I'm going to be doing next year?
And I think one of the benefits too is that it is predictable, right? Most of the organizations that we work with have a predictable calendar of appeals. They know that they're going to be sending out maybe 4 appeals minimum a year, and they're going to have these touch points. So there's some solidity in that part of it. But it sounds like if you can kind of back up just a little bit and think about the content that's going into multiple appeals and really plan it out, then that's going to be a benefit. And I think, one of the things that we do with clients is we have at least a quarterly content creation meeting where we talk quarterly about things of how we're going to message across channels in a multi-channel kind of format, how we're going to get people involved and repeat our messaging across these different ways that people are going to consume that media. And I think that's important as well.
1,000%. I see. That's why I'm a story guy and not a data guy, because I'm agreeing with you 1,000%. Yeah. So the added layer to that, Russ, what I would imagine, and a lot of the things we do is narrative framework. So if you picture like a messaging framework is really just kind of these talking points and kind of populating some talking points and what the overall campaign is. The narrative framework is an added layer to that. It's one step removed or one step expanded from that the kind of messaging framework. And I would say that's what you need to infuse a lot of your campaigns. So the campaign should be, and campaigns have a natural story arc anyway. But actually mapping that out and building that in, I think is a critical and often missing piece in a lot of campaign work.
When you think about narrative story arc, how much are you thinking about those big ideas of kind of changing the world and the reader's possible participation in that larger arc?
Constantly.
Okay.
Because that's what the kind of change we all want, right?
Yeah.
So systemic racism is a narrative.
Right.
It's a narrative that's been perpetuated throughout this country's history. So it's not going to be disrupted by any one individual, any one organization, any one donation, right? But if we want to play a part in that, it's kind of weaving all of our stories together and helping change that narrative, disrupt that overarching narrative. And so, yes, I think we all need to kind of zoom out, look at a longer timeline and a broader lens and say, okay, what are the narratives at play here? And what are the stories that we as an organization are telling to try to disrupt that narrative? And then how can the donor fit in, or the prospect fit in as a character helping to disrupt that narrative, not just helping us to achieve our mission as an organization?
Interesting. That's, it's very much reflective of what we see in political fundraising. We see that kind of narrative arc and that storytelling take place in that you have, a candidate or an opposing candidate who's an enemy, and there's the story of what they've done or this kind of threat of what they're going to do. And then that is immediately translated into a personal impact on the reader. This is how this is going to change the world for you. And then the challenge to the reader is then, are you just going to sit there and do nothing while this person ruins your world? And I think the political fundraisers maybe have an easier time of it sometimes. They've got this, they've got a very specific calendar they're working with, and they're thinking of it in terms of this arc. And the end of that story ends with election day. That's
right. I mean, when you think of some of the organizations that we work with, it is more difficult to tell that story because it is a story that transcends election cycles.
Yeah.
We need a much longer timeline to actually be able to tell that story, whether it's focused around health and disease, or it's focused around equity, or it's focused around health equity, climate change. All of these things, play out on a much longer timeline. So the struggle is, how do we actually do some narrative work there to actually show, the audience contributing to that and being able to influence that outcome?
Let me geek out with you a little bit and drill down onto one of the elements.
I'm ready to geek.
Okay, cool. So I want to drill down onto one of the elements that's really fundamental in fundraising appeals, and that is the question of building trust. How do you use storytelling to build trust with an audience?
Yes. So, Russ, a lot of the issues that we have with misinformation campaigns, a lot of the issues that we have in health and in the health sphere as a whole, all come down to compromised trust and the need to rebuild it. If we want to zoom all the way out and look at the species as a whole, right? So I'm really going to get geeky.
Let's go, baby.
Okay, if we zoom all the way out and we look at the 45,000 year history of storytelling, is in the species. Do you know what the actual evolutionary purpose they believe storytelling serves?
I would think it's along the lines of teaching people to make sure they don't die, maybe? I don't know.
So that's what I would say. But check this out. So Brian Boyd, who is an evolutionary, he did the first work of like evolutionary literature. So looking at literature and storytelling as a whole and what purpose it plays to the species. And what he found was that it actually reinforces social cohesion. That having a shared story gives us a shared vision. So we're all part of this tribe that subscribes to this story.
Interesting.
And so then, Russ, you and I are going to cooperate a lot more because we're trying to advance the IPM advancement story.
Sure.
The idea is, how do you foster that? And so to go full circle back to your question, I think, the big piece is establishing that piece of social cohesion, establishing that story that is going to connect us and connect us to the outcome that we're envisioning achieving.
Hi, this is Curtis Schmidt, producer of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, jumping in for a moment. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM Advancement, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details, and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
We have a lot of challenges with acquisition in the nonprofit world.
Mm-hmm.
And acquisition in terms of, let's look at it like you're getting someone to try to join your tribe.
Right.
And it's someone who might be a skeptic. It's someone who might have positive feelings, but you don't know, they haven't engaged with you yet. Kind of how would you look at that challenge of trying to get people to join up with your tribe? And you need to convince them, and you need to do it in a limited amount of real estate. Where do you even start with something like that?
I guess my first thing, we're talking about with prospects and individual donors, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I think again that goes back to the way we grew up, was that we consumed stories, or we passively sort of engaged in stories.
Yeah, it was story time. You sit down and you get a
And
story.
we were quiet. We crossed our legs. We
That's
listened.
right.
No matter how much sugar was in our system, we were right. Exactly. Yep. So story time became like a very passive thing. And one of the things we're seeing, and this is based, Russ, on the ubiquity of streaming services out there right now. If Netflix stopped producing content right now, right? Okay. It would take 33 years to actually watch everything that's on Netflix if they stopped right now.
Wow.
Then amplify that out to Amazon, Disney Plus, Hulu, everything else that's out there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So everyone is becoming an expert in stories. We know what appeals to us. So if our purpose is to bring, prospects or donors into, our tribe, we have to have a story that welcomes and gives them space to actually be an active participant. We have to give them agency within that story and allow room for them to become a character.
Interesting.
And so the narrative arc that you and I probably grew up with, the typical sort of, Star Wars generation, story arc is this hero's journey.
Right.
You've heard of Joseph Campbell, and, I often give workshops, and there's always somebody in the room who's done a Joseph Campbell workshop or a workshop on, and they're like, I get storytelling. And I'm like, okay, but that's not the kind of, that was then.
Yeah.
And even now, Disney is struggling with the hero's arc.
Sure. And I think a lot of nonprofits struggle with it too. I mean, you get in this rut of talking about your organization as the hero. And there's the hero journey, the first version of it where, we're providing healthy meals to lots of people and you can help. And then there's the second version where it's like, as a donor, you're making a difference. What's the step, even though that's effective, maybe with older donors, we're not seeing it as effective with younger donors. What's the step beyond that, just to really drive home this point?
So the step beyond that is fantastic. And thank you for setting me up so nicely. The next step is to actually bring the donor all the way in. So it's not just about the gift providing those meals. It's about the mission, right? It's about the vision. It's about actually helping to end hunger. So we have what we inadvertently do in engaging with donors through the traditional methods is we become very outcome focused, which again, I agree with you, is important. And again, that's the way we were probably trained to do this. And this is the way that is very comfortable to us. But the disconnect is that it becomes transactional.
Right.
By default, it becomes transactional. And so to your point, to the question that you actually asked, how do you get them into the tribe? How do you get a prospective donor into the tribe? You connect them up to the vision. So not just the outcome. Saying how many meals is great. But we also want them to see longer term what all of this is leading to and why.
So let me ask you this. It's one of the things that as a writer that I try to do is I try not to overpromise. And when you talk about these broad themes and these kind of overarching themes of, curing a disease or ending world hunger, that makes me extremely nervous to put that to paper. So how do you kind of walk that line between having a big vision and making a promise that you can actually keep?
Well, so I would say part of that is just being honest about how big the challenge of achieving that vision is. So I think what often happens when we reduce things to outcomes, and we do this part of it because it makes us feel comfortable, because we can actually say something concrete that we know. But so when we're painting these kind of big picture stories, big picture visions, and we're bringing somebody in as a contributor, a character, part of this story, we also want to make sure that they understand how big some of the challenges that we as an organization are facing and how their contribution is helping navigate those challenges.
And I think, just offering advice to writers out there who do a lot of fundraising writing, you have to find that sweet spot that you're making a promise to people and you're saying, if you have this transaction with us, you're going to get this in return, right? We work with a food pantry and, they honestly are not going to be able to solve world hunger, but they could address food insecurity in their community. And so that's what you're saying is to get it down. It's still meaningful. And you need to find that sweet spot between that huge vision of, curing whatever ails society and actually having some meaningful impact maybe in the community or with a smaller group of people that's still going to be life-changing.
Yes, that is awesome. And so again, while we individually or even as an organization or even as a statewide network, again, using food insecurity as the example, even as a statewide network, we're not going to influence that broader narrative of food insecurity or hunger. But we can play a part. We can kind of be woven into this broader tapestry. And this is, again, what disconnects us from, the traditional sort of hero myth, the hero's journey, because we're saying our contribution helps play into this larger movement, which is helping disrupt national hunger, which maybe plays into a larger movement of helping disrupt and end, global hunger. This is how we're doing it. And this is how that contribution feeds up. And that is authentic, that is genuine. Part of the reason that we focus our efforts on individuals and on individual recipients is because it's difficult to fathom things at such a large scale, right? It's difficult to go, oh man, millions of people, billions of people are going hungry. Like how do you get your head around that? So I'm not saying we need to divorce ourselves completely from that. I think that still needs to be a way that our human brain can wrap ourselves around the magnitude of the problem. But I think the scale and our role in contributing to this action overall can be amplified.
Yeah.
We want to help the audience, the donors, put themselves in this conversation and say, oh,
right.
this is how, not just this is what your gift helped us achieve, but this is what, we've been able to achieve working with you.
Yeah. We see a lot of folks moving away from an annual report or a donor report into doing an impact report and saying, here are the numbers, but here are the stories behind the numbers.
100%.
Yeah, that's a very effective way to keep people engaged. And we also see that translate into newsletters. Some of our most effective fundraising pieces nowadays are newsletter pieces. We're just keeping people engaged with stories. We're keeping people involved in the overall arc, the story of the organization and what it's doing in the community. And we're finding that people really respond to it. And they say, this is of value to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the great things about storytelling is it does provide value. When someone gets a story with information and there's an arc and there's a narrative to it, they're engaged in it in a way that they're feeling like you're contributing to their life. And that's such an important thing to do when you're actually looking to build a relationship with someone and not just a transaction.
That's right.
All right, Josh, well, let's talk about digital fundraising, or digital messaging, I should say. I immediately go to fundraising because it seems to be like a nut that nobody can figure out how to crack.
Right.
And I'm interested to get your thoughts on using the digital space to engage audiences, how storytelling kind of weaves into it, and maybe what we've seen empirically out there in terms of, what we need to be doing and why it's effective, maybe.
Yeah. I'm glad you went there. And what I would say, first of all, I feel like there is a lot of tech or a lot of tech and techniques that are applied to user experience, or that are applied to more consumer kind of campaigns or products that we just in the nonprofit space haven't brought over yet. So I always think of, some of the work that I've done, building out websites. When I was working at Runaway Hotline, we were developing the website to sort of be like its centerpiece of its digital campaign. So this was a traditional hotline. It was started in probably the 60s or early 70s, 800 number, and it was designed for payphones. So obviously, payphones don't exist anymore. Most of us don't communicate that way. And even when it's a runaway or homeless youth, you have a lot more conversations and crisis being expressed through text than anything else. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to design a website that really sort of triaged some of the most common types of calls. And so we built these sort of user journeys, story maps of what the type of caller was. So if it was a social worker who was just getting information for a school or for agency, if it was a parent whose kid had been missing for 24 hours or a couple days, and they weren't sure where to turn next or what to do. If it was a youth who was street dependent and just needed shelter or a meal or something for the evening, they're coming in with a different set of experiences and also a different set of needs. And so one of the challenges that we had when we were taking on this project is, okay, if we have a mom who's freaking out because she doesn't know where her kid is, she's not going to read a lot of copy, right, to get some answers. She wants answers now. And so how do we distill that? How do we take her emotional state into consideration and distill some of those responses down so that we can connect her to exactly what she needs in that moment? And then the same is true for the youth on the street who's looking for shelter. We may have more breathing room with the social worker, but their needs are somewhat different, and they're looking for something different. So that's how we built out the site with 4 audiences in mind, and we mapped the behaviors and the emotional states of all of them, and sort of directed them to the outcomes that we were looking for. Flash forward, when COVID kicked off, one of the things that me and my team were tasked with was to come in and to help with audiences who were sort of outliers, not adopting some of the CDC health protocols for a number of reasons, because of distrust, because of conspiracy theories, because of just not understanding necessarily the health, or because of other pressures that were on them socially, right? Yeah. And so we used some of those same techniques to say, okay, how do we actually map their experience? What are they feeling right now? What state are they in? And how can we connect them to the health outcomes that are the pro-health outcomes that we would like them to adopt for their own safety and for the safety of their community? And then helping kind of weave that into the conversation. So I share those two examples, anecdotes from those two examples, to say, we are not doing that with donors. We are not doing that with prospects. We are not doing that with campaigns. We are not thinking in terms of what is the actual user experience for a donor and how do we bring them through this journey so that they're helping contribute to the overall vision of an organization.
Yeah, and that's really important. And I love that because it's a very respectful way of looking at donors. It respects where people are kind of in their relationship with the organization. It respects their background and maybe what they're coming to and what they're bringing to that exchange with the organization. So let me ask you this, that as we're kind of winding down, I'm thinking about ways to apply this in an organization. And I'm thinking about the folks that are listening to this and they're saying, I think this all sounds really great. How the heck am I going to apply this to my organization? How do you get people enrolled in the process? I imagine that it helps to have somebody, here's a plug for us, call IPM and we're going to help guide you through it. But where does someone start in terms of enrolling other people and maybe getting their boss kind of tuned into this and really getting people on board around them, because you can't do it on your own.
Right. The story that I told at the top that I refer to as my sort of origin story, right? Like I spent 5 years actually, debating with that ED about the importance of story.
Yeah.
And that was an ongoing thing. That was like, in some ways, like a weekly conversation.
Yeah.
So for somebody who's in that position within an organization, treat it the way you would a campaign. A lot of organizational change is often an internal campaign anyway. When we're doing narrative frameworks, we're doing change management, organizational change management, and a lot of that is having an internal campaign to actually affect that change.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would also say there's like low hanging fruit that somebody in a one person shop, like, get experimental. Try to. You're not going to be able to create a storytelling culture on your own. You're just not.
Right.
But there are certain things that you can do to start looking at the appeals and some of the work that you're doing through a more narrative lens. Challenge yourself to try to shape the story in a way that is outside of the conventional, here's our organization, this is why we're wonderful, and this is what we've done.
Yeah.
And place yourself inside the shoes of the actual donor and bring them into the conversation.
Yeah, interesting. And I think that at the very core of it, it's super important to just start talking to your beneficiaries and start talking to your donors and start getting those stories. Ask for testimonials. Ask people to just communicate with you and tell you their experience. And it's going to teach you a lot about your organization. It's going to teach you a lot about what pushes people's buttons to give.
Yeah.
And that is super important. I think we make a lot of assumptions in the fundraising world about what people respond to and what is going to motivate them. And a lot of the times, if you get out there and talk to people, you might be surprised about what you hear as motivational elements of your pitch, your case for support, and all those things. So,
well, and I want to add like two things that I think are common barriers. So one is, I think organizations are often shy about telling their own story in a piece. So we'll tell the story of an organization or of an organization within a campaign, but we don't tell the story of individual like contributors, staff, and so on. We're so focused on outcome and institution, right? Institution and outcome, right? And so often we are missing all of these genuine, really culturally, lowercase c culture, rich stories and opportunities to tell some of the story of the staff and of the team and of the the people who day to day help make this happen. So that's the one thing is I think we need to overcome our shyness around that. The second thing is sometimes storytelling can feel a little silly, especially when it's actual storytelling where we're painting a picture. And oftentimes people kind of err to the side of oh, I'm just going to skip over all of this detail. No, the detail is the richness. The detail is what makes the story come alive. And so, if you're trying to accelerate through, or you're using an anecdote where really a story should be your go-to thing, you're shortchanging yourself, you're shortchanging your audience, you're shortchanging your reader. And so what I would say, just practice, describing like I do this exercise with organizational leadership all the time of describing your own experience or even the room that you're in, basic writing, techniques that we've done, like to get where we are. I think we all need to be better and more polished at doing that with our audiences.
Nice. Excellent. Well, Josh, I have one more question for you. And that is, when you sit down to write, and when you're actually thinking in a storytelling mindset, how do you get into that mindset and just be able to execute and produce that work?
Yeah. So I start with what I actually want my audience to feel. So I start in thinking in terms of what do I want them to respond with? And this actually goes back to when I was doing appeal letters years ago as like an external relations team. The director there, Paul Fairchild, who's the director or vice president of external communications for this massive organization, a human rights organization. And he would say, Josh, I want you to go all the way to the edge of schmaltzy and then take it a half step back.
Nice.
And so, I mean, it's a funny anecdote, but it just stayed with me. And I do think in terms of, okay, well, what do I want my audience to get out of reading this?
Yeah.
And part of this is strategic storytelling, right? But using that emotional piece of what do I want my audience to get out of this? So not even, Russ, not even like, oh, I want them to be moved to write a check, or I want them to give us a donation, which is often where we think the strategy starts. But the strategy really starts, even for the most data of data wonks, the strategy often starts with what are they feeling when they're encountering that data.
Yeah.
And so that's what, to me, that's how I prepare myself, is what do I want my audience to actually feel when they're encountering this?
That's great advice, Josh.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome.
I try.
Well, and it's all about, it's, I think one of the things that gets lost sometimes when we talk about creating content for audiences is that there does have to be some joy in it.
Right.
There's plenty of stuff that we're working against every day, but I think that these opportunities to connect with people are just that. They're opportunities to really connect with people on an emotional level, get beyond the logical points and tell them a story, engage them in a story so that they feel connected.
That's right.
Well, Josh Grenowitz, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for joining us on the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange podcast. This has been a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot. I'm hoping that there are a lot of good takeaways for our audience to employ when they're reaching out and using storytelling techniques and narrative arcs when engaging their audiences. Again, thanks so much, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Russ. I had a great time. I appreciate you as well. This was a lot of fun, and I don't get to geek out often enough.
Well, it was great. Let's do it again sometime soon.
Yeah. I would love it. That would be awesome.
Nice.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX Suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.